Should you start a podcast? This episode, a conversation with podcast producer Carey from Podcast Fast Track.
I think the first thing you should do is clearly define what your show is going to be about. Don't think of names. Don't think of bylines or slogans. Just think of topic. And then start thinking, do I have enough to say about this topic? Or would I have the ability to bring in enough interviews or guests or specialists to talk about this topic to warrant having a regular podcast?
I'm Chris Well, and you're listening to DIY Author. You're an author. Maybe you're taking the traditional route. Maybe you've chosen an independent path. Or maybe you want the best of both worlds. Wherever you want to go as a writer, DIY Author is here to help you on your journey with advice, encouragement, and practical tips. Because do it yourself doesn't have to mean do it alone. Welcome to another episode of DIY Author. I'm Chris Well. Our guest this time is Carey, the founder of Podcast Fast Track, a company that offers all kinds of services to podcasters, including post-production, show notes, and transcripts. We'll get to that interview shortly. First, I want to ask you a question. Are you promoting a book? If so, have you planned out your appearances in the media? Websites, blogs, podcasts, newspapers, television, the whole deal. If all of that sounds overwhelming, you'll be glad to hear about a free download that DIY Author has created to help you plan your media campaign. The Promo Rocket Media Campaign Blueprint is a document that includes checklists and simple forms to help you break down the big process into small, manageable steps. This blueprint also comes with a series of free lessons that help you focus on the right things in your book promotion and to help you pace yourself so you don't become frustrated and give up. Download your free media blueprint at DIYauthor.com/blueprint. And now for my interview with Carey from Podcast Fast Track, a production house that helps podcasters save time. When I started the DIY Author podcast a year ago, I had the best of intentions to do the whole thing myself. All the editing, all the audio processing, I wanted to do all of it myself. However, if you followed the show since the beginning, you know that it was just a few months in that I got seriously behind. It was Carey and Podcast Fast Track that helped me get the show moving again. So that's why I'm thrilled to talk with Carey today. In this interview, Carey and I discuss how to get started podcasting, why podcasting is not for everyone, and if you're thinking about a podcast, how to decide whether you should get help or go it alone. Here's that conversation. Now I'm speaking with Carey. He is an author, he is a podcaster, and his company also produces podcasts for other people. That's Podcast Fast Track. Carey, welcome to the show.
Hey, Chris, thanks for inviting me to be on the show. It's going to be a lot of fun.
So why don't we start with you as a podcaster? Now, just so people understand listening, a big part of this conversation will be about how they can podcast and how they might work with you on their podcast. But why don't we start with you? How did you get started as a podcaster?
Well, that's kind of a funny story. I was a pastor for 20 plus years, so I was weekly doing teaching, and I feel like teaching is one of my gifts. And when I retired from being a pastor, I still had that itch to do some kind of teaching. I had a ministry website going on for marriage and home kind of stuff, and I thought, well, why don't I just start a podcast? I had a little bit of background in radio, and so I knew some of the technical stuff already, so I just thought it should be a small learning curve for me. So I launched into it and just loved it right away. I had to do a little bit of learning on the digital side because things were very different from when I used to do radio. And that's how I got started. And it's been a fun ride. I haven't actually published my podcast for quite a while because my other business ventures have been booming. So I will get to that in time. But it's a really big love for me.
For somebody who wants to start a podcast or is thinking about it, what would you say are the biggest benefits of creating a podcast?
I think the biggest benefits are, number one, exposure. You have the opportunity for more and more people to have not necessarily a conversation, but a one-on-one interaction with you. And I call it an interaction because people who listen to podcasts regularly begin to feel like they know the host, even though it doesn't go the other way. And it's a really interesting thing. I've had people talk to me like they know me based on listening to something that I've said on the air. So that's one reason. Another reason is it kind of puts you out there as an expert in whatever realm you're talking about. So if you're an author or a publisher or an editor or whatever, you can do topics based around your expertise. And if you market it well and have good cover art and make the name of it pretty clear as to what you're talking about, you'll get a lot of listeners who just sign up for your podcast right away because they're interested in that same niche. And because you are publishing a podcast and they are not, they begin to see you as an expert, whether you are or not.
It seems like a lot of people, when they think of a podcast, they think of like a particular format and they think that's all there is. But podcasting, really, there are many formats.
Oh, absolutely.
Why don't we talk for a second about all the different kinds of podcasts a person could do?
Sure. Well, there's the Q&A, kind of an interview like we're doing right here, where you have a host and a guest, or multiple guests, sometimes multiple hosts. There is a Q&A kind of a style where someone solicits questions from their listeners and has a recording mechanism of some sort where the listener can actually verbalize their own question. The host then inserts that into the podcast and answers that question from their expertise. If you want a good example of that, one of my clients, Jordan Malik, does that with his podcast called Ask Jordan. And it's you can find it at askjordan.net. It's just a real simple 15 to 20 minute podcast. Doesn't take a whole lot of preparation because he knows his stuff and he can take the question and field it just kind of on the fly and then do minor editing and it's available to go. There's other genres or types of podcasts. You could do just flat out teaching some sort of a skill or some sort of a motivational kind of thing. A lot of coaches or self-help folks will do things like that. You could also do what I would call a more produced podcast where you have an NPR style thing, kind of like Freakonomics Radio, where they'll have music in the background and sound effects and multiple voices and interviews interspersed. And that is a really highly tuned skill to be able to do a podcast like that, because you have to be very organized. And there's probably, honestly, other forms of podcasts that you could do besides what I've just mentioned, but those are probably the most common.
Going along with the one you mentioned about teaching, a kind of a similar one that I've seen many examples of would be like where they're commenting or reviewing either like items in the news.
Sure.
And it could be any niche. So it could be, oh, this is news. These are 5 news items from the world of comics or the world of technology, or, you know, like I'm a mystery author. Well, if I could start a podcast, like I'm going to talk about news in mystery fiction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I have some podcast clients who do a combination of those two. They'll do an interview that is the main bulk, but they'll have a news section at the beginning that's 5 or 10 minutes long where they highlight news in their industry. So yeah, exactly. News shows could be very helpful as well.
If somebody's now thinking about doing a podcast, what are the costs of podcasting? I mean, there's money, but then there's also time and what are all the kinds of things that a person needs to factor into whether they want to do a podcast?
Yeah, well, the time thing I think is one of the biggest. For most people, they get into podcasting with this idealism about, oh, I'm going to have my own show and people are going to listen and I'm going to get thousands of downloads. Well, all that may be true, but they don't think about the time investment. If you are recording a show, setting up interviews, doing editing, uploading it to the internet, you're going to have upwards of 3 to 4 hours a week at the minimum that you're going to be putting in. Now, if you use a service like what I provide or others that are out there, that can be cut in half or even less if you're doing it the right way. So the time investment is a big deal. As far as equipment goes, most people could podcast with less than $100 worth of equipment. That would include a good mic and the cabling to connect it directly to your computer. There is some free software that you can use. Audacity is a great software program that I use for all of my professional editing. I mean, it's that powerful and it's absolutely free. So you can download that. I've got free tutorials I could send you to so that you could learn how to use it. And so that side of the piece is taken care of. And then you'll have some expenses for what's called hosting. And that basically means wherever you want to put that media file, that audio that you record, it's going to be on a hosting site where they specialize in podcasting. Now, some people will host their audio on their own website, which you can do, but most website hosting companies frown on that, and some even have it in their terms that you can't do that. Because if your show suddenly explodes in popularity and you start getting a lot of downloads, you could crash that server very easily. And that's why I recommend a hosting company. They'll be anywhere from $6 a month to $15 a month, depending on how much audio you're going to be uploading. So it's a minimal cost. And besides that, just a website if you want to have it on a website. You don't have to have it on a website. Most publishing or media hosts, rather, have an option where they give you a web page that you could send people there. So the cost in terms of actual money you put out is very minimal if you're going to do a do-it-yourself thing. If you're going to hire a service to help you with editing and publication and show notes and those kinds of things, it can rise on you from there.
And going back to what you mentioned about the time commitment, DIY Author is, in fact, one of your clients for Podcast Fast Track. And we would not be a podcast if it weren't for Podcast Fast Track.
Well, there are so many people in that boat, Chris, and that's exactly why I started the company, because podcasters are passionate about their show, but they're not passionate about what I call the time suck. It can just suck your life away in terms of time if you're not very, very organized and have a really tight system. And even people who do that at some point decide, I have this all organized, but it's still 3 hours of my time, and my time is worth more than the cost of editing all this. So I'm just going to pay someone to do it. And the question I always encourage people to ask is how much is an hour of your time worth? You figure out what that is. Say it's $70 an hour, $80 an hour. You may think really well of yourself and think it's $1,200 an hour. Well, then you have to see how many hours is it taking me to put out this podcast every week. And it becomes a self-answering formula after a while of whether you should outsource that stuff or not.
If a person wants to start a podcast, how many pieces of the process should they learn how to do himself or herself before hiring out? Or would you say just right up at the top, hire out?
I think it depends on the person. There are people that I talk to in my marketing endeavors who love the editing, and they love the actual nuancing of tweaking the audio and that kind of thing. And it's part of what they feel is their skill set and what they bring to the table, and they want to do it. I think that's wonderful. There's a lot of people who are very intimidated by all that stuff and want a podcast, but just feel like, oh, this is impossible. I could never get over that hurdle. Well, that's where someone like me might come in. But then there's maybe a third type of podcaster who is willing to do the learning curve and wants to learn how to do all that stuff, but just really knows in the back of their mind or deep in their soul, that's not the best investment of my time. That's a person who I think would be a great candidate for a service like what I do. To be fair, there are other services out there that don't require fancy equipment, don't require a whole lot of time. Things like Blog Talk and Podbean and TalkShoe. And these are all places where you call in through a phone line and it records for you and uploads to their site and has a play button, and you can send people there for your podcast. Those are all valid services. However, you need to read the fine print. They can insert ads into it anywhere they want, typically. And if you ever want to migrate that audio off of their service onto a self-hosted thing like what I've described, you typically can't do it very easily. And so it is an option, have to put it out there, but it's not the one I usually recommend.
The two big hosts, and I don't think there's a third one yet that's this big, but Libsyn and Blueberry are really the two major media hosts, right?
Yeah, those are the two big boys. Libsyn probably has the largest share of the market, and both of them really know what they're doing and are very great services. I also am familiar with a service called Signal Leaf. It's SignalLeaf.com. And it's a very good service, very comparable to the other two. It's just not as well known. And then some people will use their Amazon S3 account to host their media, and it works very, very well. I have one client who does that all the time.
Podcast Fast Track offers a range of services. You have, very on the very small end to very large packages. Why don't you give listeners a sense of the options available if they wanted to be one of your clients?
Sure. Well, the main thing that I do when I interact with someone about whether or not they want to use my service, and if so, how much it'll cost, I ask them 4 questions. The first question is, how many episodes do you want to publish per month? Okay, for most people, that's either every other week or once a week. So 2 to 4 would be the answer. Then I ask, how long is your typical episode? Average is probably 30 minutes. Some people go well over an hour. So it's just based on what you're going to be doing. The third question that I ask has to do with the level of editing that you want done on your show. Do you want no editing at all? So you're going to leave in all coughs and ums and ums and sniffles and spaces and background noise? Or do you want high level of editing where you're going to cut out all those things and you're going to really nuance the audio? And then there's a medium range in between where you want some of that, but not all of it, because you don't want it to sound too stilted or too wooden. And then the fourth question is, do you want show notes or transcripts included in that quote. Those are all of the options for what we can provide. And we could also provide artwork for every episode if you want that. But those are all the variables that I have to know in order to give a specific quote for a person. So, if you were to just ask me, what's your price per episode? Well, that depends. And that's really is the answer. It depends on lots of things that the actual podcaster wants to have as a part of their show or as a part of the service that we provide to them. So I have some clients who send me their audio. I do no editing. I just put an intro and outro on it and I throw it on their media server and they post it themselves on their website. That's probably the minimal side of what could be done. On the other end, I have clients who send me their audio. I do editing second by second. I enhance the audio. I add tags to it. I upload it to their media host. I write show notes for it. And I don't do all this. I have a team that does all this. And we even get transcripts done for it. And we post all that on their website for them. So that's the other extreme of what could be done. So for a person who really wants this all taken care of for them, they can hit the stop button after recording, upload it to Dropbox, and they never touch it again.
So someone listening is, say they're on the fence. They're thinking, maybe I want a podcast. I'm not sure yet. What are the best ways to decide whether a podcast is a good idea or a bad idea for a particular person?
That's a very good question, Chris. Yeah, there's really 6 things that I encourage people to ask about how they should determine that. The first thing is, do I want to gain a better, what would you say, persona or profile in my niche? Because podcasting allows you to establish and position yourself in your niche as an expert or a go-to guy or go-to gal, as I mentioned before. So that's number one. Secondly, do I want direct influence into the ears and therefore the minds of the people who are already interested in the subject matter that I address? To me, that's a no-brainer. Anybody who's trying to advance a business online, man, you want to talk directly to the people who are interested in what you address. And podcasting allows you to do that literally right in their ears or their earbuds, you might say. The third thing is, are my competitors taking advantage of podcasting? You need to go into iTunes, go into Stitcher, and see if your competition is getting a leg up on you in podcasting. It depends on your niche. Very specialized niches, probably not. My experience with authors, I'm assuming that may be some of your listeners here, is that there are a lot of shows starting to pop up for authors, but there is so much diversity in what you can do in terms of how you're going to approach your show and what you're going to talk about that I think there's still a lot of room there. I'm an author myself, and so I listen to a lot of those shows, and I think there's still plenty of room. Do I want to make my expert content as easy to consume as possible? Most producers would say, yeah, I want people to be able to get my stuff, enjoy it. The reason that I think this one is important is because if you think about a podcast, it's very different than video. A lot of people think, oh, professional is video. But a podcast is much more user-friendly in the sense that they can listen while they're on the treadmill. They can listen while they're driving. They can listen while they're working around the house. You can't do any of those things with video. And so I think the old days when you get these motivational tapes with a rah Amway presentation or whatever on the tape and listen to that as you're driving in your car. Well, that's what podcasting is, only with much better quality and with a direct subscription so that people get your episode every time you send it out. To me, it's a great option. The next thing I would encourage people to ask is podcasting something that I really feel a draw to? Because, if you get into podcasting and it's just not you, you feel awkward behind the mic, you feel like it's just pulling teeth to get it going, then it may not be for you. I don't think podcasting is for everyone. And then finally, do I want to maximize my opportunities for not just my current business, but possibly other business partnerships and things like that? I think of people like Pat Flynn, Michael Hyatt, Dan Miller, all these big name internet marketing people really have taken off because of their podcasts. Their podcast is what has gotten them out there. And so if you're looking for that kind of exposure that can get you opportunities beyond even just what you're currently doing, podcasting may be the way to get there.
So how much of a plan should someone have before they hit record, before they start podcasting?
I think at the very least, you need a minimal outline of what you're going to be talking about and where you want to wind up at the end of the episode. Now, I know few people, and I would say it's maybe 0.5%. So that's probably not most of your listeners who can just hit play and start talking and it comes out cogent and organized and really drives the point home. As I said, that's very few people. So I think you need to at least think through what you want to talk about, write down a bullet point outline, and even if you're using an editing service, especially, you can in the middle of your conversation say, "Oh, hang on, I want to change that. So cut that out. I'm gonna say something different," and then say something different, and all that's going to disappear in the editing. So you don't have to feel so uptight about it. I've got to get this right exactly the first time. No, you don't, because if you're going to do any editing on the show, you can always take those things out. At the very least, be prepared in your mind. Know what you're going to say and how you want to say it. You don't have to have it scripted, though I know some people who do, and they read the script and they work really hard to keep it from sounding like they're reading a script. But either way, I think you've got to be prepared on some level.
And then in terms of planning ahead, how many episodes ahead would you recommend somebody is? Now, I will say, recently you did send out an email to clients. I received one where you recommended batching.
Yeah.
Do you think everybody should batch? How many episodes ahead should a person be thinking?
Well, I think it depends partly on the person's business model and what their strategy is. If you have a really well-defined strategy and you can set your podcasting in motion alongside that, where you're promoting the same things at the same times, you may need to be 4, 5, 6 months out so that you can coordinate marketing efforts with your podcast episodes coming out at the same time. If you're not doing that kind of thing and you're just wanting to be an information giver and a content creator to help your niche, then I would say you don't need to be that far ahead. Now, batching, the reason I think, and by batching, I mean recording 4 or 5 episodes at a time, or a group of episodes, doesn't have to be those numbers. Batching is powerful because it's a time saver. You can set up your computer, take all the time to do that, get your microphone ready, do your sound check, and then do all your recording in one batch. And you don't have to set up again tomorrow and do another one, or next week and do another one. You've done it all at once. And it sounds like maybe a minimal amount of time is saved, but you'd be surprised. You'll save 20, 30, 40 minutes of your day by batching podcasts. So when I encourage my clients to batch, I tell them do 4 or 5 at a time. That seems to be a good thing. And then you're done for a month and you don't have to deal with it again for another 3 weeks. So, it's going to depend on situation, but I think thinking ahead in terms of what episodes I'm going to do when really does make sense, especially if you're doing it alongside marketing.
And for those who want to go for the high end, I mean, batching, my understanding is that the reason John Lee Dumas is able to do 8 episode every single day is that he does, he does 8 interviews every Monday, and then he uploads an entire month's worth of episodes at a time.
Yeah, I have heard John talk about that as well. He does exactly what you say. I don't know if Monday's the day, but there is one day every week where he does all of his interviews. He sets them all up on those days. He does them back to back to back to back to back to back to back. And then he does all the editing the same day. I heard him talk about that one time. So he'll do all of his editing.
Okay, that is crazy.
That is totally crazy. And he said in the interview I heard, now he may have changed his system since then, but he said that he'll stay up until 12 or 1 in the morning getting it all done. But then if you think about it, he did 8 episodes. He's done for almost 2 weeks just in one day because he does it daily. And John, by the way, started also with about 60 episodes already recorded before he even launched his podcast. So he was way ahead to begin with. He's going to stay ahead all the time. And that's really his game plan.
And it certainly works for him.
It does work for him. I know one other guy, Sean Manaher, who is doing a podcast called Sidepreneurs. He's not a client of mine.
Right.
He's just a friend. And he does a daily podcast as well. And that's the exact same thing he's doing.
Yeah. I'm just glad to finally be doing one every 2 weeks now.
I'm with you, Chris. I think the average person doesn't need to think on that level. It's not necessary.
Okay. Somebody listening says, you've convinced me. I want to start a podcast. What is the starting place? What are the basic things that this person needs to do today or this week to start working on launching a podcast?
I think the first thing you should do is clearly define what your show is going to be about. Don't think of names. Don't think of bylines or slogans. Just think of topic. And then start thinking, do I have enough to say about this topic? Or would I have the ability to bring in enough interviews or guests or specialists to talk about this topic to warrant having a regular podcast? By regular, you might mean every other week. You might mean once a week, but that's up for you to determine. Second thing I would do is to start thinking through, after you've said yes to that first section, start thinking through, okay, what do I have on hand that will enable me to do this, and what am I going to need to get? You've likely got a computer. You may have a decent microphone. Now let me just say this. Some people start out with headset microphones. That's okay if that's all you can afford or all you have. But I totally do not recommend headset microphones. They have these, they're just lower quality. They don't have the kind of sound that you'll want to have for your show. But that $100 starting point that I talked about, you can get a very good microphone. I'm using it right now for less than $70. It sounds great. I've heard quality tests between this mic and another known as a Heil PR40, which is like the industry standard, top of the line, $300 microphone. And I, Chris, can't tell a difference hearing the two microphones side by side. So this one's an Audio Technica. I think it's a 2005 is what the model number is. It costs less than $70, and you can even get it on sale from there. So you're gonna have to decide what equipment you need. Do you need software? If so, that program I mentioned, Audacity, is totally free. You can Google that and find it. And then do I have the time to learn this? Do I have the time to do this? There is a phrase in the podcasting community called pod fading. And what it means is someone starts podcasting with a big bang and then they fade out over time, usually in a quick amount of time. That happens because people don't rightly count the cost before they start. They don't think about the time suck. They don't think about the amount of expertise they have or don't have. And so they jump in and then realize, shouldn't have done this in the first place. So that's a very important piece is do I really have what it takes to do this? And do I want to do this? If you're considering doing it outsourcing, like using a company like mine or others that are out there, you have a lot less upfront stuff you've got to be ready with. You can just think, do I have the resources in terms of the guests and the expertise? And can I record every week? If so, you've got all the rest of it taken care of.
And if somebody wants to check into your services to produce their podcast, that's the podcastfasttrack.com, right?
That's it. Or you can email me directly, Carey, Carey, at podcastfasttrack.com.
Okay. And then before we go, I do want to, I mentioned at the top you are an author, but you have a brand new book. Let's see, it's Dragon Slayer Rising.
That's right.
Okay. And it is literally like the matter of days ago it came out.
Yeah, May 1st was when I released this book. It's the second in a series of 3, and it's a Christian fantasy type with dragons and swordplay and all that kind of stuff. So if you're into that stuff, I'd love to see you pick up a copy. It's on Amazon.
Okay. And as we talked before the interview, I'm going to have you on again as an author on a future episode because you're doing some very interesting things. You have some very interesting ideas about promoting the book that I really want to explore with you. But in the meantime, people can go to dragonslayerbook.com if they want to check it out.
That's right.
Carey Green, thank you for being with us today.
Hey, you're so welcome, Chris. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us this episode. Be sure and catch every episode of DIY Author. We're available in iTunes and Stitcher, and of course we have our own dedicated app. Just go to your favorite app store and search for DIY Author. This is Chris Well saying thanks for listening. I hope you'll join me again. This has been DIY Author. Please visit us online at DIYauthor.com and be sure to sign up for our email newsletter. If you enjoyed this program, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. Until next time, keep writing. And remember, do it yourself doesn't have to mean do it alone.